Hey everybody, this is a piece by Kathrin Wittler titled "Did Jews Die as Muslims in Auschwitz? Specters of the Muselmann." This article is published in Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies, volume 41, published in November 1st, 2023. So I want to look up the author's name. It says Kathrin. This is from her academic profile at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center for German Jewish Literature and Cultural History. And it says Kathrin Wittler was a Minerva Research Fellow at the Rosenzweig Center for April 2015 until November 2016. During her stay in Jerusalem, she completed her award-winning book, Morgenländischer Glanz, eine deutsche jüdische Literaturgeschichte, 1750 to 1850, which was published in 2019 in the Schriftenreihe Wissenschaftliche Abhandlungen des Leo Bach or Bach Institute. Since 2017, Kathrin is a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the Peter Jandy Institute for General and Comparative Literature, Freie Universität Berlin. Her research focuses on literary multilingualism, German/Hebrew, the reception of the Bible, Orientalism, book cultures, and literary solitude. Her second book will be a contribution to the field of comparative literature, exploring the genre aesthetics of solitude. In addition, Kathrin is involved in two historical projects in the field of Jewish studies. Together with Uta Lohmann, she is preparing an edition of the Maskil Yoluva's Breslau writings, 1791 to 1801, founded by the DFG, together with Johannes Zakai. I don't know if I'm saying that right. She is working on a biography of the poet and secret agent Joel Jacobi, who lived from 1811 to 1863, funded by the Gerda Henkel Stiftung. Kathrin's publications include essays on, and this is a title of an essay, Orientalist Body Politics, Intermedia Encounters between German and Polish Jews around 1800, published in 2019, Traveling Images and Orientalist Knowledge in Philipson's Israelistische Bibel, Leo Bach Institute Yearbook in 2017 on the history of the appellation Muselmann, and on Heine's German Jewish Orientalism. So here we go. I also wanted to look up Muselmann. Muselmann was a term used amongst prisoners of German Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust of World War II to refer to those suffering from a combination of starvation, known as, quote, hunger disease, and exhaustion, as well as those who were resigned to their impending death. The Muselmann prisoners exhibited severe emaciation and physical weakness, and apathetic listlessness regarding their own fate, and unresponsiveness to their surroundings owing to their barbaric treatment. Some scholars argue that the term possibly comes from the Muselmann's inability to stand for any time due to the loss of leg muscle, thus leading them to spend much of their time in a prone position. Muselmann also literally means, quote, a Muslim in Yiddish and a number of other languages, albeit spelling differences, and ultimately derives from the old Turkish word for Muslim, Musliman. So, here we go. Here's the abstract for the piece. It says, in the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, especially in Auschwitz, prisoners were marked by utter physical prisoners marked by utter physical and psychological exhaustion were called Muselmänner, or Muselmann. In recent years, based on a passing remark by Giorgio Agamben, many have taken this linguistic phenomenon to mean that Jews died as Muslims in the Holocaust. Quickly absorbed into current political theory, intellectual discourses, and discussion forums on the internet, this idea has become as widespread, as widely misunderstood, but all but turning Muselmann into a buzzword which may be misused for anything from Jewish Islamophobia to U.S. American torture practices. The paper retraces the historical semantics of the German word Muselmann and discusses the possible reasons for its introduction into the language of the concentration camps, based on the finding that the word's Orientalist implications do not sufficiently explain its use in the concentration camps, and that neither guards nor prisoners employed it with the intention of turning Jews into Muslims. The paper cautions against the transfer of the word Muselmann's historically specific use, developed under extreme conditions, into the heated political debates of the present. In the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, especially in Auschwitz, prisoners marked by utter physical and psychological exhaustion were called Muselmänner, quote, Muselmann. From the first testimonies of survivors to historical scholarship and philosophical considerations, the use of an outdated German word for, quote, Muslims, for these, quote, walking dead, end quote, has been attributed with a mixture of mysteriousness and self-evidence. In their seminal study of the Muselmänner, first published in Polish in 1938, Zdzisław Rin and Stanislaw Kladziński, these are my guesses at the names, wondered why this rather banal but also, quote, somewhat exotic and deformed word, end quote, was applied to the prisoners in the concentration camps. One second. I wanted to look these people up. It just looks like they're historians. Yeah. And who's the other person? Stanislaw Kladziński. Stanislaw Kladziński, born May 4th, 1918 in Krakow, died November 1st, 1990, was a Polish pulmonologist, social activist, documentalist, prisoner of the German concentration camps in Auschwitz-Birkenau and Mauthausen-Gusen, witness in the trials of Nazi war executioners, advocate of spreading the truth about the times of Nazism and Polish-German reconciliation, one of the initiators of the compilation of the Auschwitz notebooks. All right, back to the text. While referring to the origin of the term as, quote, unclear, its adoption to the language of the camps appeared, quote, symptomatic to Mona Kurta. In the book, If This Is a Man, published in 1947, Primo Levi, remarked that the reasons for referring to the Muselmänner by this name were unknown to him. If This Is a Man, published in the United States under the title Survival in Auschwitz, is a memoir by Jewish-Italian writer Primo Levi, first published in 1947. It describes Levi's arrest as a member of the Italian anti-fascist resistance during the Second World War and his incarceration in the Auschwitz concentration camp, Monowitz, from February 1944 until the camp was liberated on the 27th of January 1945. Back to the text. The term Muselmann's equivocal semantics reflect the difficult status of a social construction under extreme conditions and its uneasy position in the remembrance of the Holocaust. Footnote. See Becker and Bach's article, Rethinking the Muselmann, and Skitolski's article, Finding Man in der Muselmann, and Oster, Impossible Holocaust Metaphors. Back to the text and footnote. The term's equivocal semantics reflect the difficult status of a social construction under extreme conditions and its uneasy position in the remembrance of the Holocaust. Consequently, considerations of the unsettling condition of the Muselmänner between life and death often went hand in hand with conjectures on the obscure origin of the term. Footnote. For an overview, see Zofsky, The Order of Terror. And the description for that book says, during the 12 years from 1933 until 1945, the concentration camp operated as a terror society. In this pioneering book, the renowned German sociologist Wolfgang Zofsky looks at the concentration camp from the inside as a laboratory of cruelty and a system of absolute power built on extreme violence, starvation, quote, terror labor, end quote, and the business-like extermination of human beings. Based on historical documents and reports of survivors, the Order of Terror details how the resistance of prisoners was broken down. Arbitrary terror and routine violence destroyed personal identity and social solidarity, disrupted the very ideas of time and space, perverted human work into torture, and unleashed innumerable atrocities. As a result, daily life was reduced to a permanent struggle for survival, even as the meaning of self-preservation was extinguished. Zofsky takes us from the searing, unforgettable image of the Muselmann, Auschwitz jargon for the, quote, walking dead, to chronicles of epidemics, terror punishments, selections, and torture. The society of the camp was dominated by the SS and a system of graduated and forced collaboration which turned selected victims into accomplices of terror. Zofsky shows that the SS was not a rigid bureaucracy, but a system with ample room for autonomy. The SS demanded individual initiative of its members. Consequently, although they were not required to torment or murder prisoners, officers and guards often exploited their freedom to do so, in passing or on a whim, with cause or without. The Order of Terror described by Zofsky culminated in the organized murder of millions of European Jews and Gypsies, in the death factories of Auschwitz and Treblinka. By the end of his book, Zofsky shows that the German concentration camps cannot be seen as a temporary lapse into barbarism. Instead, it must be conceived as a product of modern civilization, where institutionalized state-run human cruelty became possible, with or without the mobilizing feelings of hatred. And that was the description for The Order of Terror by Wolfgang Zofsky. End footnote. Many survivors pointed to supposedly Muslim or Oriental gestures, customs, or postures when asked about the word's meaning. According to some, the Muselmann, when seen from a distance, looked like a, quote, Mohammedan procession, a sort of communal prayer, end quote, or, quote, praying Arabs, end quote. Others thought that the rags which the Muselmann tied around their heads during the winter resembled turbans, and that their intrusiveness when asking for food was reminiscent of the behavior of, quote, Oriental beggars, end quote. Yet others pictured Orientals wrapped in blankets or thought of accounts of famines in the East. The testimony suggests that the word's use in the camps was based on Orientalist and colonialist notions. Over the years, many scholars have taken up the survivors' attempts at an explanation adopting the stereotypes involved. The Encyclopedia Judaica summarized that the camp slang word, quote, seems to have originated from the typical deportment of the sufferers, e.g. to squat with their legs tucked in a, quote, Oriental fashion, end quote. Hans Merzalek aligned the uncoordinated movements of starving prisoners with Islamic prayer practices. Wikipedia says Hans Marzalek lived from 1914 to 2011 and was an Austrian typesetter, political activist, detective, historian, and suspected spy for the Soviet Union. A devout socialist and active in the resistance, Hans Marzalek was arrested by the Nazis and imprisoned in the Mauthausen concentration camp. After the war, Hans Marzalek joined the Austrian political police and was instrumental in tracking down and convicting numerous Nazi criminals. Hans Marzalek also became the main chronicler of the camp's history, helped establish the Mauthausen Memorial Museum, and published several books. Jan Marzalek, a fugitive former businessman and suspected spy operative for Russia, is his grandson. Back to the text. Implying that the word's use was motivated etymologically, Eugen Kogan stated matter-of-factly in 1946, quote, in the camps they were called, quote, Muslims, end quote, men of unconditional fatalism, end quote. Wikipedia says Eugen Kogan lived from 1903 to 1987, was a German historian and Nazi concentration camp survivor. A well-known Christian opponent of the Nazi Party, Eugen Kogan was arrested more than once and spent 6 years at Buchenwald concentration camp. Known in Germany as a journalist, sociologist, political scientist, author, and politician, Eugen Kogan went on to be considered one of the, quote, intellectual fathers, end quote, of both West Germany and European integration. Eugen Kogan's 1946 book titled The Theory and Practice of Hell still stands as a basic reference on Nazi crimes. End footnote. Or not end footnote. Back to the text. In the past years, these speculations have reverberated into philosophical discourses taking on a life of their own. Giorgio Agamben influentially installed the Muselmann, quote, the human that cannot be told apart from the inhuman, end quote, as, quote, the true cipher of Auschwitz, end quote, in the third part of his major work, Homo Sacer, and assumed that the words used derive from the idea of Islamic fatalism, allegedly manifest in the, quote, literal meaning of the Arabic word Muslim, one who submits unconditionally to the will of God, end quote. Agamben. Footnote. See Agamben, Remnants of Auschwitz. This book's published by Princeton University Press. The description for Remnants of Auschwitz, The Witness and the Archive by Giorgio Agamben says, the description is just a quote from Agamben. It says, quote, in its form, this book is a kind of perpetual commentary on testimony. It did not seem possible to proceed otherwise. At a certain point, it became clear that testimony contained at its core an essential lasuna. In other words, the survivors bore witness to something it is impossible to bear witness to. As a consequence, commenting on survivors' testimony necessarily meant interrogating this lasuna, or, more precisely, attempting to listen to it. Listening to something absent did not prove fruitless work for this author. Above all, it made it necessary to clear away almost all the doctrines that, since Auschwitz, have been advanced in the name of ethics. For my own part, I will consider myself content with my work if, in attempting to locate the place and theme of testimony, I have erected some signposts allowing future cartographers of the new ethical territory to orient themselves. Indeed, I will be satisfied if Remnants of Auschwitz succeeds only in correcting some of the terms with which we register the decisive lesson of the century, and if this book makes it possible for certain words to be left behind and others to be understood in a different sense, this is also a way, perhaps the only way, to listen to what is unsaid. End quote. Giorgio Agamben. Back to the text and footnote. Agamben identified the Lager term, Muselmann, with its alleged lexical meaning, and in many instances conflated the act of calling others, quote, Muslims, with the act of making them Muslims. Footnote. As Jill Jarvis has pointed out, Agamben's explanation is not only oblivious to the reductive Orientalism involved and to the colonial context attached, but also endorses a notion of sanctified sacrifice that had led Agamben to reject the term, quote, Holocaust as inadequate. See Jill Jarvis's article, Remnants of Muslims. End footnote. Thus reframed, the category lingers between ontology, history, epistemology, and metaphor, and is prone to misunderstandings. One passing remark in Remnants of Auschwitz has had particularly far-reaching resonances. According to Agamben, it is, quote, certain that, with a kind of ferocious irony, the Jews knew that they would not die at Auschwitz as Jews, end quote. Agamben. Remnants of Auschwitz. This elusive sentence, taken to mean that Jews died as Muslims in the Nazi extermination camps, was soon picked up in different strands of cultural and political theory. Jill Anidjar insisted that one should not hide the words alleged true meaning behind the antiquated form Muselmann. Since in his book, The Jew, the Arab, Gilles Anidjar, insisting that one should not hide the words alleged true meaning behind the antiquated form Muselmann, asks in his book titled The Jew, the Arab, quote, how did the Jews, but not only the Jews, perhaps not even mostly the Jews, and yet still the Jews, come to be called Muslims, end quote. Gilles Anijar. Gilles Anijar teaches at Columbia. He's the professor of the departments of religion and the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. His books include, at least the English ones are, Blood, A Critique of Christianity, published in 2014, Semites, Race, Religion, Literature, published in 2002, and in 2003, The Jew, the Arab, A History of the Enemy, and, quote, Our Place in Al-Andalus, end quote, Kabbalah, Philosophy, Literature, in Arab Jewish Letters. And the book, wanted to look up the book as well. The Jew, the Arab. The Jew, the Arab, A History of the Enemy by Gilles Anijar, published in 2003 with Stanford University Press. The description of the book says, is there a concept of the enemy? To what discursive sphere would it belong? Or, if there is no concept of the enemy, what are the factors that could have prevented its articulation? Following the reflections of Carl Schmitt and Jacques Derrida on the theologico, political, and reading canonical texts from the Western philosophical, political, and religious traditions, the author seeks to account for the absence of a history of the enemy. The question of the enemy emerges in this book as contingent on the way Europe has related to both Jew and Arab as concrete enemies. Moreover, the author provocatively argues that the Jew and the Arab constitute the condition of religion and politics. Among the many strengths of the book is the timeliness of its profound study of contemporary actuality. The volume provides a basis for a philosophical understanding of the forces at work that produced and kindled current conflicts in Europe, the U.S., and the Middle East. Back to the text. This question, which again is, how did the Jews, but not only the Jews, perhaps even mostly the Jews, and yet still the Jews... Let me repeat that. This question from Gilles Anijar, which is, again, quote, how did the Jews, but not only the Jews, perhaps not even mostly the Jews, and yet still the Jews, come to be, parenthesis, called, and parenthesis, Muslims, end quote. Gilles Anijar has acquired provocative potential as it has been associated with the Israel-Palestine conflict and taken up in debates about global terrorism, torture practices, and Jewish-Muslim-Christian relations. Footnote. See Zaloa, Continental Philosophy, and the Palestinian Question. Continental Philosophy and the Palestinian Question, subtitled Beyond the Jew and the Greek by Zahi Zaloua, is published by Bloomsbury, and the description says, from Sartre to Levinas, continental philosophers have looked to the example of the Jew as the paradigmatic object of and model for ethical inquiry. Levinas, for example, powerfully dedicates his 1974 book, Otherwise Than Being, to the victims of the Holocaust, and turns attention to the state of philosophy after Auschwitz. Such an ethics radically challenges prior notions of autonomy and comprehension. two key ideas for traditional ethical theory, and more generally the Greek tradition. It seeks to respect the opacity of the other and avoid the dangers of hermeneutic violence. But how does such an ethics of the other translate into real everyday life? What is at stake in thinking the other as Jew? Is the alterity of the Jew simply a counter to Greek universalism? Is a rhetoric of exceptionalism with its unavoidable ontological residue at odds with shifting political realities? Within this paradigm, what then becomes of the Arab or Muslim, the other of the Jew, the other of the other, so to speak? This line of ethical thought, in its desire to bear witness to past suffering and come to terms with subjectivity after Auschwitz, arguably brackets from analysis present operations of power. Would then a more sensitive historical approach expose the Palestinian as the other of the Israeli? Here, Sahi Zalua offers a challenging intervention into how we configure the contemporary. Back to the text. End footnote. In her book on the Muslim question, Anne Norton reminds her readers of the term, Muselmann's, quote, hidden meaning. Quote, Muselmann names Muslims. It names those who inhabit the camps at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. Can never pronounce that right. And certain other sites that only some can name. It names those Muslims who inhabit camps awaiting deportation. In each of these moments, the name of Muslim is given to the most reduced bare life, end quote. Anne Norton. On the Muslim Question by Anne Norton, which has the subtitle, I don't know if this is a subtitle, it's just a blurb. Why the, quote, Muslim question is really about the West and its own anxieties, not Islam. And the description for this book says, in the post 9/11 West, there is no shortage of strident voices telling us that Islam is a threat to the security, values, way of life, and even existence of the United States and Europe. For better or worse, quote, the Muslim question, end quote, has become the great question of our time. It is a question bound up with others about freedom of speech, terror, violence, human rights, women's dress, and sexuality. Above all, it is tied to the possibility of democracy. In this fearless, original, and surprising book, Anne Norton demolishes the notion that there is a, quote, clash of civilizations, end quote, between the West and Islam. What is really in question, she argues, is the West's commitment to its own ideals, to democracy and enlightenment, to democracy and the Enlightenment trinity of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In the most fundamental sense, the Muslim question is about the values not of Islamic but of Western civilization. Moving between the United States and Europe, Anne Norton provides a fresh perspective on iconic controversies, from the Danish cartoon of Muhammad to the murder of Theo van Gogh. She examines the arguments of a wide range of thinkers, from John Rawls to Slavoj Žižek, and she describes vivid everyday examples of ordinary Muslims and non-Muslims who have accepted each other and built a common life together. Ultimately, Anne Norton provides a new vision of a richer and more diverse democratic life in the West, one that makes room for Muslims rather than scapegoating Muslims for the West's own anxieties. Back to the text. Similarly, Joseph Pugliese sees, quote, specters of the Muselmann, end quote, in the Guantanamo Bay detainees. Footnote. See the article by Pugliese titled Specters of the Muselmann. End footnote. In his book on commemorative culture in the wake of 9/11, David Simpson notes that, quote, it should give us pause for thought, end quote, that the weakest prisoners in the Nazi extermination camps were kept at a distance by being identified as Muslims. Quote, what does it mean, end quote, David Simpson asks, quote, that a Jew near death should call another Jew nearer death a Muslim, end quote. David Simpson. David Simpson's book, The Culture of Commemoration, 9/11, The Culture of Commemoration, was published with University of Chicago Press. And the description says, after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, a general sense that the world was different, that nothing would ever be the same, settled upon a grieving nation. The events of that day were received as cataclysmic disruptions of an ordered world. Refuting this claim, David Simpson examines the complex and paradoxical character of American public discourse since that September morning, considering the ways the events have been aestheticized, exploited, and appropriated, while, quote, ground zero remains the contested site of an effort at adequate commemoration. In 9/11, the book, David Simpson argues that elements of the conventional culture of mourning and remembrance, grieving the dead, summarizing their lives in obituaries, and erecting monuments in their memory, have been co-opted for political advantage. He also confronts those who labeled the event a, quote, apocalypse, condemning their exploitation of 9/11 for the defense of torture and war. In 4 elegant chapters, 2 of which expand on essays originally published in the London Review of Books to great acclaim, Simpson analyzes the response to 9/11, the nationally syndicated, quote, portraits of grief obituaries in the New York Times, the debates over the building of the World Trade Center towers and the memorial design, the representation of American and Iraqi dead after the invasion of March 2003, along with worldwide circulation of Abu Ghraib torture photographs, and the urgent and largely ignored critique of homeland rhetoric from the domain of critical theory. Calling for a sustained cultural and theoretical analysis, 9/11 is the first book of its kind to consider the events of that tragic day with a perspective so firmly grounded in the humanities and so persuasive about the contribution they can make to our understanding of its consequences. Back to the text and footnote. While this question, David Simpson asks, quote, what does it mean that a Jew near death should call another Jew nearer death a Muslim, end quote, ultimately leads Simpson to claim that, quote, the binary distinction Jew-Muslim does not hold up in the face of what occurred even in Auschwitz, end quote. Others have drawn less conciliatory conclusions. Parvez Manzoor finds in the term's use, quote, the perverse logic of the Holocaust. While the Nazis killed the Jews in turn sacrificed the, quote, Muslims, end quote, die Muselmänner, exclamation point, end quote. So I couldn't find anything on the internet about Parvez Manzoor. Not only does this allegation, which says, again, was, quote, the perverse logic of the Holocaust. While the Nazis killed the Jews in turn sacrificed the, quote, Muslims, end quote, die Muselmänner, end quote. Along with its implication of Jewish Islamophobia, Falabe's somewhat perverse logic itself is also based on false premises. Firstly, the word Muselmann was neither used exclusively by Jews, nor was the word Muselmann exclusively used to refer to Jews. In the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, the term was employed by Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners and by the guards. Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners, when marked by utter physical and psychological exhaustion, were called Muselmänner. Secondly, and more importantly, it seems questionable whether guards or prisoners intended to call (other) prisoners Muslims, or wanted to turn them into Muslims when calling them Muselmänner. Attending to the word's historical semantics, it is important to note that in the 1930s and 1940s, the German word Muselmann was not commonly used anymore to designate Muslims. The retrospective Orientalist speculations, quoted above notwithstanding, its original lexical meaning, quote, Muslim, end quote, it faded even before the word acquired its horrific new meaning in the Lagersprache. What the hell does that mean? Where the hell am I? Looks like it has something to do with language of concentration camps or something like that. I'm not sure. You can't really find what it means. The first thing that comes up on Wikipedia says language of Nazi concentration camps. Language of Nazi concentration camps is a common stratum created in various languages of inmates of Nazi concentration camps that describe the notions unique to life in the camps and served as a lingua franca. One part of the Nazi camp slang was German language terminology for people, things, and events in the camps, where many ordinary German words acquired specific meanings and associations. Another was ad hoc slang based on the various native languages of inmates from different countries. Back to the text. In this contribution, I wish to make a case for considering the word's complex historical semantics before using it in the heated debates of today on global inequalities, interreligious conflicts, and international justice. Historical semantics may help understand why the allegedly, quote, hidden meaning of the camp slang word Muselmann does not allow us to establish a direct link between Jewish victims of the Holocaust and the Muslim prisoners of the present. New section. Historical semantics of the word Muselmann. Muselmann, like the English equivalent Muselmann, is a variant of Muselmane or Muselmane, Muselmane, a word for, quote, Muslim, which entered the German language via the Persian Muselman and its Turkish derivation. In German as well as in English, it was pseudo-etymologically interpreted as a compound of, quote, Musel and Man, or muscle and man, respectively. In German, the word was mainly in use during the 18th and early 19th centuries, as can be seen in the famous praise of Nathan in Lessing's Enlightenment drama Nathan the Wise of 1779, to whom, quote, Jew and Christian, Muselmann and Parsi are all equal, end quote. And in Goethe's advertisement of his West Eastern Divan, or Divan, in 1816, with the ambiguous declaration that he himself might be a Muselmann. Wikipedia says Nathan the Wise is a German play by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing from 1779. Nathan the Wise is a fervent plea for religious tolerance. Nathan the Wise was never performed during Lessing's lifetime and was first performed in 1783 at the Dublinisches Theater in Berlin. Set in Jerusalem during the Third Crusade, Nathan the Wise describes how the wise Jewish merchant Nathan, the enlightened Sultan Saladin, and the initially anonymous Templar bridged their gaps between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Nathan the Wise's major themes are friendship, tolerance, relativism of God, a rejection of miracles, and the need for communication. And what else was I looking for? West Eastern Divan by Goethe. West Östlicher Divan, or West Eastern Divan, or Diwan, is a diwan, or collection of lyrical poems by the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It was inspired by Goethe's readings of the Persian national poet Hafez. Back to the text. Sorry. Just wanted to see if I was missing something. Okay, sorry. Missing a footnote. However, being considered a linguist... However, being... Jesus Christ. Excuse me. However, being considered a linguistically corrupt form by the early 19th century, the word Muselmann slowly fell out of use. Judging from 19th century German dictionaries and encyclopedias, the term Muslim, and Mohammedaner became more common than Muselmann, while the more, quote, correct form, Muselmana, was still occasionally used. During the Nazi regime, then, Muselmann was at most an outdated variant and not the standard term for Muslims. Thus, some newly arrived prisoners in the camps wondered about the use of the German Muselmann, plural, Muselmänner, instead of Muselmana, plural, Muselmannen, and respectively the Polish derivation Muselmann instead of Muselmanin, the standard term in Polish for, quote, Muslim. The archaic form in German and the abbreviated form in Polish are indicative of the word's citational character. Some testimonies support this intuition. In her childhood memoirs, Every day was Yom Kippur. Holocaust survivor Renetta Yesner recounts her experiences in the Stut concentration camp. Quote, "Don't be a Muselmann," end quote. This expression steadily recurred in the conversation. There's two quotes there. Quote, "Don't be a Muselmann." This expression steadily recurred in the conversations, and I could not make any sense of it. Mother explained to me that it referred to people who were more dead than alive. End quote. Renata Yesner. So I tried to look that up. I didn't see anything for it. Oh, sorry. That's because it's a German book. Jeder Tag war Yom Kippur. That's what the book was actually called. The description for this book says, Renata Yesner grew up as the eldest daughter of a wealthy Jewish family in Kaunas, Lithuania. She was shaped by the colorful and varied city life as well as by the extended summer holidays at her grandfather's rural Dacha. However, in this well-ordered world, unimaginable things suddenly happened. First, the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania, and shortly thereafter Hitler's troops marched in. Renata's father was deported by the Nazis, and the rest of the family was forced to move to the ghetto. There, Renata experienced hunger and death for the first time. These became constant companions throughout her childhood. Back to the text. Yesner's recollection of the repeated warning, quote, "Sei kein Muselmann," don't be a Muselmann, may be a clue to the mysterious origin of the term. It is a quote from a popular children's canon. It says, Caffee, don't drink so much coffee. Not for children is the Turkish brew. Harms the nerves, makes you pale and sickly too. Don't be a Muselmann who can't keep off his hands. Footnote. English translation by Hannah Kempkin. End footnote. The canon is attributed to Karl Gottlieb Hering, a musical pedagogue from Saxony. He lived from 1766 to 1853 and was probably composed in the early 19th century. Many of Hering's songs include a popular Christmas song, gained the status of folk tunes. Hering's canon, Kaffee, which is sung in German schools even today, could be found in many song collections of interwar and Nazi Germany, among them Mädchenliederbuch für katholische Mädchenvereine, songbook for Catholic girls' clubs. Published in 1919, Lieder der Bundischen Jugend, Songs of the German Youth Movement, published in 1929, Lieder der NS-Gemeinschaft, quote, Kraft durch Freude, end quote. Songs of the NS Leisure Organization, Strength Through Joy, published in 1936, and Chorliederbuch für die Wehrmacht, Songbook for the German Defense Forces, published in 1940. The canon starts by intoning the descending chord of the notes corresponding to the letters of the word Kaffee, and combines this musical instruction with a drastic warning of coffee consumption and its bad impact on health, namely inducing paleness and sickness and weakening the nerves. The song's monitory example of the Turkish Muselmann calls on a long tradition. The idea of the, quote, sick Turk can be traced back to the Second Turkish Siege of Vienna, which inspired a Bavarian clergyman to write the poem The Turk is Sick, Der Turk ist krank, in 1683. Apparently, this is in reference to the Battle of Vienna, which took place at Kahlenberg Mountain near Vienna on the 12th of September, 1683, after the city had been besieged by the Ottoman Empire for 2 months. The battle was fought by the Holy Roman Empire, led by the Habsburg monarchy, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, both under the command of John III Sobieski, against the Ottomans and their vassal and tributary states. The battle marked the first time the Commonwealth and the Holy Roman Empire had cooperated militarily against the Ottomans. The defeat was a turning point for Ottoman expansion into Europe, after which they would gain no further ground. In the ensuing war that lasted until 1699, the Ottomans would cede most of Ottoman Hungary to Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. The battle was won by the combined forces of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the latter represented only by the forces of the Crown of the Kingdom of Poland. The march of the Lithuanian army was delayed, and they reached Vienna after it had been relieved. The Viennese garrison was led by Feldzeugmeister of the Holy Roman Imperial Army, Ernst Rüdiger, Graf von Starhemberg, an Austrian subject of Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. The overall command was held by the senior leader, the King of Poland, John III Sobieski, who led the relief forces. The forces of the Ottoman Empire and its vassal states were commanded by Grand Vizier Merzifanlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. The Ottoman army numbered approximately 90,000 to 300,000 men. According to documents on the order of battle found in Kara Mustafa's tent, initial strength at the start of the campaign was 170,000 men. They began the siege on the 14th of July, 1683. Ottoman forces consisted, among other units, of 60 ortas of janissaries, 12,000 men paper strength, with an observation army of some 70,000 men watching the countryside. The decisive battle took place on the 12th of September, 1863, after the arrival of the United Relief Army. Some historians maintain that the battle marked the turning point in the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars, a 300-year struggle between the Holy Roman and Ottoman empires. During the 16 years following the battle, the Austrian Habsburgs would gradually conquer southern Hungary and Transylvania, largely clearing them of Ottoman forces. The battle is noted for including the largest known cavalry charge in history. Back to the text. It also appeared, the idea of the sick Turk also appeared in Montesquieu's Persian letters, where the term, the Turk is sick, the sick Turk, was figuratively associated with stimulants. Montesquieu's Persian Letters is a literary work published in 1721, recounting the experiences of two fictional Persian noblemen, Uzbek, and Rika, who spent several years in France under Louis XIV and the Regency. Back to the text. The fictitious Persian traveler Uzbek relates, quote, I was astonished at the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. Its sick body is sustained not by a gentle and moderate regime, but by violent remedies which persistently weaken it, leaving it exhausted, end quote. In the 19th century, the formula of the, quote, sick man upon the Bosporus, end quote, was established in the context of the Eastern question, bringing together the image of the, quote, sick Turk as a religious as well as political enemy, and the fashionable and popular, quote, Turk's drink, end quote, coffee. Herring's song proves to be a product of 18th and 19th century Orientalism. That the canon became popular is not only due to its didactic usability and its catchiness, but also to its place in cultural history. It draws both on the Christian European tradition of a politically and religiously motivated animosity towards Muslims, who are referred to by the umbrella term, quote, Turks, and on the equally rich tradition of Turkeria, ranging from the Ottoman sofa to Cafe Turk and the tulip. Turkery or Turkeria, anglicized as, quote, Turkery, or Turquoiserie, was the Turkish fashion in Western Europe from the 16th to 18th centuries for imitating aspects of Ottoman art and culture. Many different Western European countries were fascinated by the exotic and relatively unknown culture of the Ottoman ruling class, which was the center of the Ottoman Empire. This fashionable phenomenon became more popular through trading routes and increased diplomatic relations between the Ottomans and the European nations, exemplified by the Franco-Ottoman alliance of 1715. Ambassadors and traders often returned home with tales of exotic places and souvenirs of their adventures. The movement was often reflected in the art of the period. Music, paintings, architecture, and artifacts were frequently inspired by the Ottoman styles and methods. Painting in particular portrayed the Ottomans with bright colors and sharp contrasts, suggesting their interesting peculiarity and exotic nature. Back to the text. Herring's children's canon is by no means the only record of a coupling of the idea of the, quote, sick Turk with the term Muselmann. In his early carnival farce, Der Reformed Turk, which premiered with little success in Vienna in 1867, Austrian author Ludwig Anzengruber played with the pseudo-etymological interpretation of the word Muselmann as, quote, Muselmann, or Musselmann, by engaging the Jewish billbroker Rosendorn in a dialogue with the Christian tailor Bugelberger. Ludwig Anzengruber lived from 1839 to 1889 and was an Austrian dramatist, novelist, and poet. He was born and died in Vienna, Austria. I don't know. I'll look up his play, but I don't know if there's anything going to be on it. No. Carrying on. The Christian tailor Bugelberger is trying to establish himself on his inherited property in Turkey, including a harem. Questioning the tailor's project of establishing a new life in the Orient in his old age, Rosendorn tauntingly asks whether he feels as yet, quote, enough man for Muselmanning, end quote. Quote, fühlen Sie sich noch so viel Mann für die Muselmännerei? End quote. Contesting Bugelberger's manliness and virility, Rosendorn asks in a mocking tone what may be the result of subtracting the, quote, man from, quote, Muselmann. Quote, Mann von Muselmann subtrahiert, bleibt Musel, was ist das, was sein Sie nachher, wenn Sie bloß Musel sein? End quote. After several burlesque entanglements in the complex political situation of the Eastern Question, the tailor finally gives up and returns to Vienna. The play ends with his farewell to Turkey, personified as a sick old man who threatens to infect his European neighbors. Quote, Ada Türkei, du kranker Mann. Ada, du steckst ja so die Nachbarn an und uns tut gnug weh. Ada Türkei, du alter Herr. Ada. Der Abschied fällt uns gar nicht schwer. Juha. End quote. As Ensign Gruber's farce testifies, the word Muselmann invited jokes and puns that connected matters of political and physical potency with the idea of the, quote, sick Turk. This connotation seems to have been important also for the word's use in the concentration camps, where male prisoners tried to protect their manliness alongside their human dignity. Footnote. See the article by Becker and Bach, Muselmänner in Nazi concentration camps. End footnote. The many possibilities of playing on the word Muselmann and of connecting the word Muselmann with physical and political impotence and a defective manliness continued to be exploited in the 20th century beyond its corrupted use in the language of the concentration camps. On the 31st of August 1949, the German comedian Heinz Erhardt's highly popular radio series So was Dummes, titled House, or translated as How Silly, broadcasted from the radio station NWDR, Northwest German Broadcasting in Hamburg, featuring a song called Märchen vom Muselmann, Tale of the Muselmann. I'm going to look up this comedian. In Wikipedia, it just says Heinz Erhardt lived from 1909 to 1979 and was a German comedian, musician, entertainer, actor, and poet. I'm going to read the German Wikipedia because Heinz Erhardt lived from 1909 to 1979 and was a German comedian, musician, composer, entertainer, cabaret artist, actor, and poet. Erhardt rose to fame in the post-war period initially through stage appearances, and from the 1950s onwards also through leading roles in films and his own television shows. His humor was characterized by a playful use of the German language, for example, through wordplay or twisted sayings. In the ZDF program Unsere Bestien, Comiker and Co., Heinz Erhardt was voted second in the 2007 election for Best German-Speaking Comedian. Back to the text. Before beginning to tell the tale, Heinz Erhardt explains that a Muselmann is, quote, a follower of Muhammad, a Mohammedan, end quote, just like a follower of Buddha, following his tongue-in-cheek linguistic logic, is not a, quote, Buddhist, parenthesis, as he would correctly be called in German, in parenthesis, but a, quote, Boudicca, end quote, parenthesis, a German dialect term for an innkeeper, end parenthesis. These humoristic lexical explanations reflect considerable uncertainties in the handling of the term Muselmann. The tale itself is about a, quote, Muselmann, end quote, who once upon a time got intoxicated. Quote, Es war einmal ein Muselmann, der trank sich einen Dusel an. His, quote, Muselwife, quote, Muselvibe, brought him wine from the wine region by the river Moselle, or, as Erhardt puns, Musel, parenthesis, quote, Moselle, Muselwein, end quote, in parenthesis, until Erhardt finally got sick. Until he finally got sick, and depending on the interpretation of the ambiguous German verb entschlafen, either fell asleep or passed away. Quote, dann trank und trank hin sank als Kranker, bis Gott sei Dank leise entschlief, end quote. With each of his word plays, Erhardt elicits gales of laughter from his audience. His song presents a dark adult version of the children's canon. Alcohol assumes the role of coffee, and like in Hering's canon, its addictive potential is associated with sickness and death. While it is unclear whether Erhardt was aware of the use of the word Muselmann in the concentration camps, Erhardt's tale proves the word Muselmann to be charged with connotations of weakness and sickness. But already by the early 20th century, these connotations had in part replaced the word's original lexical meaning. Linguists have pointed out that by then many people associated the expression Muselmann solely with a pale, sick, and weak or even dumb person and not with the Muslim culture or religion. In Berlin dialects, for instance, the word Muselmann denoted a, quote, phlegmatic man, end quote. In Eastern Yiddish dialects, people with disabilities were insulted as Geilimer Turk, that is a, quote, lame Turk, end quote. The survivor, Herbert Herklotz, relates that he did not understand the lager term to mean, quote, Muslim, because he was familiar with it from his childhood as a pejorative for old and frail people. One second. I'm going to look this guy up, see if he's somebody of note that I should know. Now, anyway, moving on. Considering the findings, Danuta Veslovska argues that the words adoption into the Lager language can be explained by the colloquial and dialectical usage of the expression as an insult against the sick and weak, rather than by alleged visible resemblances to Muslims. I keep using this word Lager language, and I don't know what the hell that means. Is that just like concentration camp language? I'm not sure. I think that does, because it's German. The German word says here, the German word for concentration camp says Konzentrationslager. So I guess that's just like Lager language. Okay, so that's what that means. Survivor Herbert Herklotz relates that he did not understand the Lager term to mean Muslim, because he was familiar with it from his childhood as a pejorative for old and frail people. Considering these findings, Danuta Veslovska argues that the word's adoption into the Lager language can be explained by the colloquial and dialectical usage of the expression as an insult against the sick and weak, rather than by alleged visible resemblances to Muslims. Even more explicitly, Marie Simon posits that without being connected to Islam in any way, the term Muselmann was introduced into the language of the camps by the SS and used cynically to name the most miserable prisoners. But while the word's use in the camps was marked by an amplification of the semantics of sickness and weakness, which it had acquired well before the Nazi era, the many retrospective associations of turbans, prayer practices, and Islamic fatalism suggest that the Orientalist entanglement between the semantic fields of sickness/weakness and Muslims/Turks also contributed to its establishment in the language of the camps. In contradistinction to current Western perceptions, however, Muslims were not necessarily equated with Arabs. While Turks and Jews have been suspected to form a secret alliance from the Middle Ages, Jews were presented as the mutual enemy of Germans and Arabs in the Nazis' foreign policy, and Jews were separated from Arabs in the taxonomies of the Nazis' racial science. These distinctions may have been enhanced by a stereotypical juxtaposition which had gained currency in the 19th century Orientalist imagination. On the one hand, the despotic, materialist, urban, effeminate Turks. On the other hand, the noble, authentic, manly Bedouins of the deserts. This juxtaposition in turn may have helped to invest the stereotypes of despotic, materialist, urban, effeminate Jews as opposed to the noble, authentic, manly Germanic people with some Orientalist pseudo-evidence. While it is against this backdrop probable that the use of the word Muselmann in the camps can be explained, as sometimes has been suggested, by the classification of Arabs and Jews as, quote, Semites, it is possible that these derogative traditions of Orientalist imagination fueled the word's use in the camps. New section. Historical semantics in the discourses of the present. Historical semantics may help explain why the word Muselmann was used to refer to prisoners on the brink of death in the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. It seems plausible that the word was introduced into the Lager language through Herning's widely known song, Kaffe, or Kaffee, which condenses didactic warnings of weak will, sickness, and death in the image of the Turkish Muselmann. Due to the canon's popularity, it is possible that the word was appropriated by German-speaking prisoners. A more likely explanation is a sarcastic use of the song by camp guards. The admonishing of the song not to be a Muselmann, sei doch kein Muselmann, that is, not to give up on oneself and thus to preserve oneself from sickness and mental breakdown under the dehumanizing conditions of the camps, seems to have become all but disengaged from the Orientalist context of the song. The word's lexical meaning, quote, Muslim, had faded even before. Widely used in dialects and sociolects for the weak, the old, and the sick, the word Muselmann was adapted as an insult in the Lager camp language's frame of reference. It was already well tested in its function of degradation and rejection, and could on this basis be reframed to refer to prisoners marked by utter physical and psychological exhaustion under the extreme conditions of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. While retrospective speculations on alleged similarities, be it body language, behavior, or clothing, between Oriental Muslims and Muselmänner of the Holocaust attest to the persisting Orientalist implication of the word. The term as it was used in the camps cannot be reduced to its archaic lexical meaning, quote, Muslim. The reconstruction of these complicated historical semantics may caution against an all too easy transfer of a term's historically specific use, developed under extreme conditions, into the heated political debates of the present, even if, or perhaps especially if, this transfer is mediated by philosophical speculations. In the wake of Agamben's Homo Sacer, the figure of the Muselmann gained considerable philosophical currency. While some scholars have criticized Agamben for theorizing away the historical specificity of the Muselmänner, many others have found inspiration in Agamben's work and have further generalized the Muselmann into a figure of critical thinking. Footnote. See, for example, Le Capra, History in Transit. Looking for a description of this book. History in Transit by Dominic Le Capra. History in Transit, Experience, Identity, Critical Theory, published in 2004 by Dominic Le Capra, comprises Dominic Le Capra's explorations of relationships he believes have been insufficiently theorized, between experience and identity, between history and various theories of subjectivity, between extreme events and their representation, between institutional structures and the kinds of knowledge produced within them. Taken together, these discussions form a dialogical encounter, posting the links among epistemological questions, historicist questions, and issues pertaining to disciplinary and institutional politics. Reacting against the anti-theoretical bias of some prominent historians, Le Capra presents an alternative model of historiographical practice, one in which emphases on plurality and hybridity are combined with the concept of historical experience. For Le Capra, experience emerges as a category both theoretically determined and anchored in the facticity of the everyday. Dominic Le Capra tests the assumptions and implications of the way one approaches the past by looking to psychoanalysis to render more self-aware the relationship between the historian and his or her material. He offers criticisms of assumptions held by practicing historians and theorists, placing the study of history at the center of a larger argument about the role of the contemporary university. Contesting both corporatization and claims that the university is in ruins, Le Capra writes, quote, "It is paradoxical that the demand to make the university conform to an ever-increasing extent to a market or business model seems oblivious to the fact that the American university has probably been the most successful in its type in the world. that students from other countries disproportionately desire to study in it, end quote. I don't know. Back to the text. Sorry, I'm spacing out for a second. End footnote. For Slavoj Žižek, for example, Agamben's Muselmann embodies, quote, the zero-level neighbor, the neighbor with whom no empathetic relationship is possible, end quote. While the old lexical meaning, quote, Muslim, tends to be ignored in these abstractions, the notion that Jews were allegedly turned into Muslims in the Nazi concentration and extermination camps has taken on a life of its own. Quickly absorbed into current political theory, intellectual discourses, and discussion forums on the internet, this idea has become as widespread as widely misunderstood, all but turning Muselmann into a buzzword which may be misused for anything from Jewish Islamophobia to U.S. American torture practices. The less carefully the term is taken up, the greater is the danger that the, quote, figure of the Muselmann indeed becomes a, quote, specter, a specter haunting current discourses. That's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening.